Pulse webinar, where we're going to discuss the data from our recent Pulse survey report. We'll start with some introductions. My name is Ashika Patel, and I'm a Senior Vice President with CCS Fundraising and been with the firm for 10 years. Thank you all so much for making the time to be with us. I've had the great pleasure of doing work in the human services sector for quite some time, currently working with My Friend's Place in Hollywood, California, where I'm based. They are a homeless youth services organization, a critical service to the community here. And I've worked with Direct Relief in the past, as well as Community Action Partnerships, a national network of human services organizations that are located in local neighborhoods to provide everything from food services to shelter, education needs, et cetera. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ian Swedish, for an introduction.
Thanks, Ashika. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. My name's Ian Swedish. I'm also a Senior Vice President at CCS. I've been with the firm for about 12 years, and I live and help lead our Philadelphia office. But my roots actually with CCS started in Chicago in the human services sector with Feeding America and their network, and my career has really spanned that sector and largely in a lot of networked and federated nonprofits, Feeding America, Habitat for Humanity, United Way, among others. But we are just thrilled to be with you today and looking forward to the conversation.
Ian, I just want to go through a quick outline of our discussion today. I'll begin with an overview of today's philanthropic landscape to help orient the background or the backdrop of some of the data that we're going to go through. Ian will then start us off with a review of the CCS Philanthropy Pulse report. We'll spend the bulk of our time kind of talking about this report as it relates to the human services sector specifically. It would be great for us to engage in some interesting Q&A after you have a chance to look through the results. So please keep track of any questions. And after that, we'll go into some breakout rooms so that you can probably share some ideas and those questions with your colleagues, share some ideas, and we'll wrap up with some closing remarks after that. Before we dive in, it would be great to just start with a quick icebreaker. Our group is pretty intimate, about 50 of us here on the line. Drop in the chat, if you don't mind, the name of your organization, where you are located, and the office, if that's where you're working. Are you working remotely or a little bit of both? Kind of what's your work situation? All right, Sarah, thank you for kicking us off. Wonderful. It's so great to see that there are folks from all over the country here on the line. That'll lead to some really great discussion about what you're seeing in fundraising roles or fundraising adjacent roles in your marketplace currently, and also a good mix of in-person and remote. Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Keep dropping those in. We'll get started by talking about the philanthropic landscape. And one thing I want to note is the 2021 numbers are not out just yet. They'll be out in the next few weeks. And so, we're really going to be looking at, for this philanthropic landscape overview, 2020 numbers that were reported last year in 21. So the 21 numbers will be reported in 22. So if we could just flip to the next slide here. Giving USA found that US charitable giving reached an all-time high in 2020. $471 billion raised in the sector across the board, which is just an incredible increase of 38% in inflation-adjusted dollars from giving levels at the start of this decade. So just over the course of 10 years, seeing that growth is incredible. Today's philanthropic landscape is one of resiliency and responsiveness and continued evolution. That was a trend that we saw based on the 2020 numbers. And I anticipate that as we look to 2021, we'll kind of see that settling in a little bit more deeply. On average, individuals, foundations, and corporations gave a combined $1.29 billion each day. Giving USA attributed this strong growth to the stock market and stock market performance by the end of 2020, which was looking a little different right now, An outpouring of generosity is also a factor of this in response to COVID-19 and its sort of effects long-term and short-term on human needs. And we also saw the efforts to advance racial equity in these numbers, so that informs the data as well. On the following slide, we'll take a little bit of a deeper look at this statistic. The human services sector provides services to a variety of populations, including our most vulnerable citizens. And it's interesting to see that human services was the sector that received the third largest share of philanthropic support for a total of $65 billion. Giving to human services sectors and services has grown consecutively for 7 years, including in 2020. That's when we saw giving to human services reach its highest ever level in inflation adjusted terms. I also want to note that, when you look at some of the other sectors that are represented on this slide, there's a human services bend to really all of the work that we see in the philanthropic sector. When we think about the environment and efforts to support and preserve the environment, there is a human service outcome ultimately to that effort. So it's just important, I think, to think about that. Even though human services is carved out as a marker here, it's kind of woven into some of the other sectors and the work that they do programmatically. So just that something to keep in mind with the report overall. We will provide a link to the full report beyond just the human services sector report, so it'd be valuable to take a look at the full piece. I'll turn it over to Ian from here to introduce us to the Pulse survey and kind of get us diving into those numbers.
Yeah, thanks. And, I just go, Ashika, back to kind of what you led off, some of the broader philanthropic landscape trends are. And that data is about to be refreshed. And we are, constantly, I think, as a broader nonprofit and fundraising sector, kind of looking back with a little bit of lag on the larger annual performance and those trends. And it's just one of the kind of byproducts of the work that we do. And that was, in some ways, some of the motivations for the Pulse survey, in that, keeping a more real-time, fingers on the pulse of the sector trends and the way that development and philanthropy shops and CEOs were really, kind of feeling about performance, external and internal influencers. So with that as a little bit of a backdrop, as an introduction, the next page, just kind of gives a little bit of highlight on the makeup of the participants of this Pulse survey. And, we launched this particular survey in November and December, or we're collecting data in November, December of 21, which in some ways is a very short time ago. Although these days the world is moving and changing so fast, it's hard to know what was recent anymore. But you can see the distribution here of the participants by location, by the individual and their role within the organization. And I think a broader, just context for you all is, I think about 800, almost 900 survey responses were collected. And the human services sector had a very healthy representation in that, about 20%, more than 20% of the participants were human services focused organizations. So what we're going to go through today, we think is a very healthy representation of the sector, but also, how the sector is kind of influencing the broader nonprofit and fundraising landscape. So just a couple of last comments here. Location, fairly evenly distributed representation across the United States. Leaders of development and advancement shops and CEOs and executive directors make up, nearly 2/3 of the respondents. So we are hearing from leadership, we are hearing from frontline fundraisers, and as we'll discuss a bit later today, the role of diversity and equity and inclusion within the organization's mission and focus, and how prominent that is, where over 80% of the organizations responded there saying that that was in fact part of the organization's mission. So with that backdrop, the next page kind of dives into some of the themes that we're going to be looking at, right? And at the time we were really kind of drilling into what is your outlook for 2022? What are some of the challenges that you're going to be facing? What are some of the capabilities of your team, of your organization? How are you navigating those opportunities and challenges in the senses of adjusting and pivoting some of your practices? We're also looking at staffing and resources and trends there. And then finally, DEI, the role of DEI in the organization's mission, fundraising case for support, donor in engagement. You'll see on the next slide that as we kind of pivot into the outlook for 2022 and start to look at the data, which actually I believe is on the next slide, is there, thank you, is that when we asked organizations about their anticipation in the change of results for fundraising programs for the upcoming year in 2022 compared to 2021, there was really broad optimism when you kind of think about it, right? I mean, it really cut across, all fundraising programs. Certainly major gifts was the most optimistic. Growth in major gifts at 62%, kind of forecasting an increase in results, the leader there. But I think one of the things that really stuck out to us was optimism across the board. Corporate giving was really the only area where kind of closing in on about 20% of respondents thought that there might be a decline. And, as we know, we didn't get into it earlier, but, corporate giving is the smallest, kind of slice of the pie in the US. So I think, certainly very interesting to us to see kind of broad-based optimism heading into 2022 about different verticals and fundraising programs. The next slide, kind of really drills into, how are organizations receiving gifts? What are some of these sources or vehicles? And when you think back to the previous slide that we were looking at, and kind of the optimism or the prominence and the role that organizations see for major gifts or the growth in major gifts, I guess not super surprising to see that, family foundations and donor advised funds, two prominent individual giving vehicles, right, are what organizations too are kind of pointing to by far and away the most of the ways that they've received gifts over the past 2 years. But what also I think really struck out to us is the diversity in the way that organizations are receiving gifts. While family foundations and DAFs, certainly the most prominent, appreciated assets like stocks and securities, bequests, charitable trusts, also, very much the individual giving programs or individual giving vehicles, that are kind of prominently part of the human services giving portfolio. So if we kind of move to the next slide and we look a bit at, kind of thinking about the organization's strategy for calendar year 2022 and the role of capital and comprehensive campaigns, I think what we saw here was another signal of optimism heading into 2022, and kind of a signal of the current landscape and how that's tied to the optimism in major gifts too. Right. About a third of respondents did not have a plan for a campaign, but and about another 11% just weren't sure. But the balance of organizations, about 2/3 of organizations or so, were in the planning stages, actively in a campaign or on the verge of kicking off of a campaign. And I think, one of the things that certainly signals to us is the crowded marketplace. This is an area where I think it's really helpful to look outside of the human services sector, particularly those of you that are, kind of regional or metropolitan service area focused organizations, and just thinking about that broader landscape. This was not unique to the human services sector. This was something that really cut across the entire nonprofit landscape sector in the sense of the role that campaigns were playing and the activity there. So kind of a two-sided sword there, right? On one side, certainly speaks to the optimism, the readiness of constituent pools that organizations feel that their donors and prospects are ready for a campaign, that the organization can be successful in a campaign. But there certainly is that crowded landscape aspect to it, that there are a lot of campaigns happening right now, and navigating that crowded landscape, I think, is a big part of strategy that organizations are thinking about. The last slide that I'm going to comment on just for a few moments is the next one on page 15, which really kind of jumps into, or I guess actually I'm kind of turning it over to Ashika here, right, Ashika? Sorry about that. I got mixed up. I thought there was one more.
Again, you led us perfectly to
Great.
How I want to start this section, challenges and capabilities, which are so interesting in the work of fundraising, because every organization has challenges raising money, and it's impossible to solve all of those challenges. So a lot of times we have to figure out how we work around them. And I'm really excited to share this section of the data with you, because I do think it demonstrates how in the human services sector specifically, there's this willingness to kind of solve for challenges related to fundraising to reach those outcomes of success. To start off, let's begin with a poll. I'd love to hear from all of you. What was the top fundraising challenge that you sort of experienced? Or what do you believe is the top reported challenge, excuse me? So if you were to venture a guess, we'll take a look just on the next slide. What would you think was reported as the topmost challenge for fundraising in the human services sector? A couple more seconds. Perfect. Thank you. Donor acquisition. Interesting. So our poll shows us that the group here is kind of neck and neck in thinking that retention and stewardship are among the greatest reported challenges, as well as leveraging data to make sort of those better decisions. And you are right, at least in one of those areas. Retention / stewardship is a top 3 challenge. The greatest challenge is donor acquisition. And when we kind of think about what this data is telling us, acquisition and retention strategies in our work are becoming more and more complex as competition for that nonprofit dollar continues to increase. And so if retention and stewardship practices are also a challenge alongside acquisition, then we kind of need to look at the whole ecosystem of how a donor is sort of coming to our organization, how they're experiencing the impact of our mission, the impact they're essentially investing in, and then how they find their way back to giving, how they find their way back to making a contribution to this work. On the following slide, you'll see that a 71% of human service respondents saw an increase in new donors. So even though retention is acquisition is a top reported challenge, human service organizations are persevering and still continuing to see sort of this increase in new donors despite the challenge that is presented in that effort. A combined 71% reporting that is pretty significant. Their organization had seen either a significant increase, about 10%, in the number of new donors, or a modest increase, 61%, in the number of new donors. And while acquisition may be challenging, it's still incredibly possible, and that's what this data should tell you. How donors find their way to your work is the question to be considering when you're trying to problem solve around some of the fundraising roadblocks that might be in your way. How can we make the journey smoother and more direct for a donor that's looking to support your work? As climate change and other issues around social equity continue to become challenging, more and more donors are going to find themselves giving to human service organizations. And so I anticipate that the acquisition element is a key strategic area to continue watching. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, every sector of the philanthropic space will touch human services in some way. And so if we kind of forecast looking at all of the sectors, seeing that, in education and in health, the dollars that need to become available to make the outcomes possible that we so desperately need, those dollars are as competitive as ever. And we're going to be facing kind of that same challenge. So how do we think about marketing our organizations to new donors and that entry point that they're ultimately going to follow to make that first gift? On the following slide, I kind of want to take a closer look at organizations that saw increases in new donors and the expectations that they sort of have for donor retention, which are significant. Among human service organizations that reported, they experienced either a significant or a modest increase in new donors since 2020. 1/4 of those respondents expect to retain 41% or more of those new donors. More than 80% of the organizations report that they plan to use targeted and general interest mailings and emails to help retain those new donors. One of the things that was really interesting in the work that we did, pre-pandemic with an organization like Direct Relief, for example, that relies on sort of an influx of new donors to sustain their overall growth. And then post-pandemic, with organizations like Community Action Partnerships, My Friend's Place, what we see is that the idea of retention is really about just stewardship and accessibility. So sometimes we create plans as organizations with the intention to steward our donors, but those plans are not exactly accessible. Are we sending, hard copy mailings when the bulk of our base is interacting online? Are we using an antiquated system of reaching them with those emails, with those mailings, in a way that they might be behaving on a different platform, right? Are we sending messages to their email boxes when they're actually interacting with us on socials? So I'm looking forward to kind of turning this over to Ian shortly, because I know later on in this presentation, we sort of talk a little bit about technology and tools, but we'll have a chance to dive a little deeper into some of that. All right, we can head to the next slide, please. So some of the adjusted practices. Though we move forward in a COVID-informed world, there are a few pandemic practices or pandemic era practices that we anticipate will remain as we do the work of fundraising in the human services sector. On the following slide, you'll see that as of November 2021, a combined 62% of human service respondents had at least partially resumed in-person donor meetings or events. Just under half of the respondents had partially resumed these activities, and 13% have gone completely sort of back in person, resuming all of their donor activities. Fundraising in the human services sector is truly rooted in human connection, either the human connection that happens with leadership within the organization or the human population that the mission is seeking to serve. And I anticipate that we will continue to see this percentage grow as human service organizations look to bring donors back to experiencing mission moments in person. It's great to see that so many of you who responded in the chat are kind of back in the office. That presence or sort of that ability to be available to donors who want to come in and see your mission work or who would like for you to take them on site somewhere to see your mission work, that will make a big difference in the fundraising outcomes that you sort of are working towards with those individuals. But I do believe also that the remote introduction to human services work just creates greater accessibility for donors who are looking for varied experiences. We're finding more and more, again, through online giving and those sorts of things, that some donors really want to stay sort of behind the screen. They're not looking for stewardship. They're not looking for kind of our traditional engagement that we would typically see with major donors. And providing sort of a remote option for engagement, right? A remote team that's available to engage those individuals in the capacity they want to be engaged can also just be an entry point, a sustainability point for keeping that donor with you as long as possible. I'll turn it over to Ian here to kick us off with a poll question kind of in this space of electronic working.
Yeah, thanks. So pull your mouse back out. We are interested, you know, in and I just had an old poll. I don't know if the poll just popped up and popped back down for everybody else, but we are, you know, hoping to get your insights, right? So we kind of reflecting on Ashika's, you know, recent comments. What have you learned, or what practice did you in leadership integrate, or your team integrate over the past 2 years, or, you know, in the heart of the uncertainty of mid 2020 through mid 2021 that you are going to keep in place? And so the options here are, you know, the virtual events, the hybrid part-time or occasional remote work schedules, the remote work altogether, or a you know, increase in presence, or increase in enhanced presence with social media. So those are our options. We will kind of pull that back up and just see that the remote work, kind of the hybrid, the reemergence, you know, definitely kind of out in front of everybody else here. And I imagine, just kind of looking across the Zoom screens right now, you can kind of see that in practice, right? Folks are, you know, still very much kind of back and forth, or very much working from home. So second there, part-time occasional work schedules, and very much complementary that. And you know, those two made up of the 85%. Susan, I see your comment, frowned upon to work from home. And I mean, that is an interesting dynamic, right? Certainly kind of a cultural question that I think a lot of leaders are navigating. I think there's the dynamic of kind of wanting to have people, you know, back in the office with, I think, a lot of the workforce, you know, preference, you know, to have that flexibility. So let's keep moving, right? And kind of keeping that thread, right? Many respondents intending to kind of adapt this remote work, virtual events. We didn't see the virtual events kind of shine out in the poll that we were just looking at, right? But in November and December, that was one of the kind of leading responses at the time, was to kind of maintain, you know, this virtual event strategy. But certainly the remote work, the hybrid, full part-time, you know, really kind of led the adoption, which you know, is not perhaps a direct fundraising strategy, right? But certainly when we think about talent acquisition and retention, which I think is on every organization's mind right now, certainly kind of prominently comes up in day-to-day conversations that I have with my client partners. You know, that the remote work piece is you know, is certainly a factor there in attraction and retention. But when we look below to some of the fundraising strategies, right? Virtual events. I actually haven't seen that as much in practice this year as I did last year. So I will be interested to see kind of in the next poll survey if the reliance on virtual events maintains, but certainly enhancing and investing in social media and the digital transformation. Two other prominent strategies that are more directly tied to fundraising and philanthropic revenues are the other key takeaways here. So with that, if we kind of pivot to the next slide, we will kind of dive a little bit more into staffing and resources, how organizations are thinking about their teams, and where they're in, how they are investing in staff and resources, which I think has also been impacted by the last 2 years. So the first slide in this section, if we kind of pivot to the next one, is another poll question. And what we want to know from you before kind of jumping in here is, how are you all using external vendors or consultant services? And I think this is one where you can we want you to kind of drill in on a single choice. We know that you might have multiple here, but if you could kind of zero in where you've invested the most, whether that's in the DEI initiatives and planning, graphic design, staff training, or strategic planning. And we'll see the results here. DEI initiatives, certainly the plurality of the group, and strategic planning right behind that. Not surprising, obviously, integrated in the fabric of your organizations and your missions is, equitable services, inclusive, fulfillment of your program. So, really telling to kind of see that, and certainly I think if we had asked that question 2 years ago, I think these responses would have looked fairly different. So pivoting to kind of page 26 or the next slide, you'll see that the responses in November, December certainly mirrored that. You note here graphic design, strategic planning, DEI initiatives are the top three. A little bit of a reversal of the order from this group today, right? Graphic design, more of a, what we might refer to as a vendor, transactional partnership, right? Whereas strategic planning and DI more, trusted advisors, thought partners, with the organization. So two different types of outsourcing there. But it was interesting for us to kind of see, that distribution, and certainly in November, December, to see graphic design kind of popping up in the lead there above kind of three things that are more strategic in nature, was eye-opening, but kind of also spoke to that there's just kind of limited bandwidth on teams right now. There's kind of increased pressure and demand for human services organizations programs, and that's dominoing into time, resources, and bandwidth of the team. And so you kind of see some of these more kind of vendor-based services, graphic design, prospect research, annual fund appeals, things like that. So the next slide, we kind of jump into, organizations really kind of talking about their fundraising staff capabilities and where they feel like their teams, have their most knowledgeable or the most sound. And, event planning, certainly was the leader by quite a bit here, right? I mean, almost double in terms of completely knowledgeable or, kind of really holding a strong skill set than the other areas that we were looking at. Which is interesting when you think about it, right? I mean, over the last 2 years, certainly event planning has had to take just a remarkable pivot in shape. If events haven't been in person, it kind of speaks to the skill set at hand, and that group's, that kind of like that kind of core of a skill set we really having to evolve in real time. On the flip side, where there isn't as much of a knowledge base, right, is gift planning and plan giving, which is an area of giving that both accelerated during the pandemic and during COVID, in part because people were thinking about their estates and their wills and generational family planning, and also in part because of the trend of what we've been talking about really in large part is kind of broader fundraising strategy planning for the last 10 years. And that is, we are in the midst of, we are, just starting to kind of live through the greatest, transfer of generational wealth in America. And so, this is an area where certainly I think over the next 5 years, we will see more and more knowledge growing in gift planning, because it will be in kind of a critical source of fundraising. Let's pivot to the next slide, because that kind of gets into one of those middle bands of kind of knowledge base. If you looked at the middle of the page on that last chart, you saw kind of comfort level with databases and CRMs. And our team was talking, and if you look at the right slide here, it's like, how satisfied are you with your CRM? And it's about 65% of respondents said that they were satisfied. And I think the joke is, like, you don't hear people talking about their satisfaction with their CRM. It's more of the challenges that they're having with it, right? So admittedly, this is one of the bigger surprises for me, maybe not the most, strategic of questions that we asked, from a broader organizational side. But certainly day to day, databases from inputs to the exports and the reports and the utilizations are a fabric of our lives, right? I mean, our kind of like fabric of our jobs. And so that was a surprise. We're going to see a little dichotomy with that. I'm foreshadowing another finding in a couple of pages. But you see Salesforce and Blackbaud, certainly the industry leaders and what organizations are using, but a bit of fragmentation too with that other category down at the bottom. The next slide kind of gets into a little bit of, like what makes the difference in satisfaction levels of database management, right? And I think the biggest piece there is not surprising, is the clear expectations for, what's being entered, how it's being entered, and who's doing that, right? I mean, I think that we all kind of at our foundation understand that systems and operations are kind of founded on, we're going to get out of our data what we put into it. And I think there's more and more investment being put into normalizing data entry across development teams because of the value of reports, analytics. That's a byproduct of that type of work. Dissatisfaction, is just kind of with the systems themselves, right? Not feeling like their CRM was user friendly. And inconsistencies and inaccurate and incomplete data, which really kind of points to, in a lot of cases, inconsistencies in the staff who are managing the database. And I think kind of more and more organizations and leadership are putting value in investing in talent to manage these systems, because that creates kind of long-term data consistencies that they otherwise wouldn't have with staff turnover. Ashika, I'm going to flip it back over to you to kind of take us home, and as we pivot to the last part of our discussion.
Thanks, Ian. Just a thought on your last slide there, which is so important, especially in human services work. Donors stay with you traditionally for a really long time. And those investments that Ian was talking about, organizations making, kind of seeing the top response here for satisfaction. What we put into the database is really going to determine, how the value of what we get back. And that has an impact on retention that we talked about earlier. It has an impact on acquisition as well. It's really great to see everyone interacting in the chat, and I hope to see some more of this discussion come out in the Q&A and the breakout rooms. We'll head to the last section of our presentation on the next slide here, just talking a little bit about DEI in the work of fundraising and what we're seeing. I'd like to begin with a quick poll question. Is your institution actively including DEI in your strategic plans for future fundraising priorities? Yes or no? Maybe you're considering. Let's take a look. All right. It's excellent to see that DEI is a consideration for 6 out of 10 of us on the call at the organizations that we're working with. This is going to become an increasingly important part of the conversation around donor acquisition, donor stewardship, donor retention. There used to be a time when we would think about giving motivations in a very narrow way. But with the rise of just a new immigrant population of donors that come from different cultures and different contexts related to philanthropy, those motivations will become more varied. So let's take a look at what the data tells us about this area in particular. A combined 94% of human services respondents reported in our survey that their organization discusses the concepts of DEI with donors either always, frequently, or occasionally. 69% of those respondents said that DEI is part of their organization's strategic plans for the future and for fundraising priorities. So pretty similar to how this group responded. I think we were at like 63%. So good to see some similarity there. And when answering these questions, just as an aside, respondents were asked to consider a pretty expansive definition for diversity, equity, and inclusion to address sort of a broad set of identities, including race, ethnicity, gender, and otherwise. And so we really kind of need to take a broad definition when we think about some of these things and how they're manifesting, particularly in the donor experience at our organizations. Taking a closer look at this, we asked organizations what tactics they're using or have used over the last 2 years to make their fundraising activities more diverse, more equitable, or more inclusive. And we found that the most popular responses are making changes to the board and sort of board-related practices. And so when I think about that in the context of fundraising activities, a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive board will attract a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive donor base. Oftentimes, especially in human services, when people are thinking about a philanthropic investment, they are investing in the leadership that is committed to bringing impact towards mission, right? It's the people at the leadership helm of the organization that are actually going to lead the work in the direction it needs to head. And so seeing that some of these DEI changes are most popularly happening at the board level is a good sign for outcomes related to DEI and donor acquisition and retention. So something for us to just think about in the context of the organizations that you're working with. The second response is modifying the message used with donors. It's been really interesting in our fundraising space to see the number of creative articles and webinars related to inclusive donor messaging and writing. How are we telling the story of the work our organizations are doing in a way that opens the door as widely as possible for understanding, for relatability, so that someone who is probably doesn't fit sort of the more common profile of donor for your organization, someone who's a little bit of an outlier, would be able to find an entry point into the work that you do and sort of see themselves being a part of the impact related to mission. Lastly, the top three, the third response in our top three is offering DEI training to fundraising staff and to board members. It's really important and good to see that our fundraising teams are learning how to talk about this work, and more importantly, how to introduce this work in the context of the fundraising that we're doing to see the type of outcomes that we want to see the donor landscape become more diverse, to see that the sector is more inclusive when thinking about acquisition strategies. And so really promising data. I'll end here just by noting that if you're interested in exploring more findings from this report, which Ian and I only touched on a few, and there's so many great pieces of information in there, Please download the full copy. You can just follow this QR code here from our website. It's also available there, along with some other really great pieces of material, particularly related to human services, if you're interested in seeing that as well. I'd like to take a moment just to facilitate some Q&A. If there are any questions from the group, please feel free to put them in the chat. And we'll give it a minute or so to see if anything comes in, but I know we have some really great discussion probably brewing among all of you for our breakout room, so we can move there also. All right, thanks, Stephanie, for kicking us off with our first question. Curious to see if other social service organizations are seeing younger donors contributing. That's a really great question to put in the chat, and I'd love to see responses from the group here. But Stephanie, from my perspective, and Ian, I'd love to hear your perspective and kind of what you're seeing. Younger people are beginning to join into giving calls to action, right? We really saw that during the conversation around racial equity in the United States. And as we look at human services in particular, younger people tend to have a greater pulse on some of the systemic issues that are affecting human services work, in particularly homelessness. Keith, when I think about younger, and I think about younger kind of in the space of major gifts, I think about younger in the space of philanthropy. Typically, people are being introduced to philanthropy, a little bit later in their 30s and their 40s. And so kind of making their first sort of small gift even at that time as well. In major gift work, one of the places we see donor generational demographics emerge is in the independent school world. So families who are starting their kid in like pre-K, for example, that's one of the first times they're understanding, what philanthropy is and why it's important to be part of the philanthropic community. So when we think about generational giving or kind of trying to mobilize a younger generation of donor, I think of people in their 20s, 30s, early 40s in that space and how we can bring those folks to our work. Ian, any thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like these are things where I really see, two sides of the coin. Certainly, I mean, there are a lot of studies out there. I was just speaking with a company that's launching a new product on Friday through the Apple Store that's aimed, just at this. It's called Rise, and that 84% of millennials, are philanthropic or have motivations to be. So the statistics tell you that certainly that the younger donor segments are philanthropic. I do think that the group is naturally kind of curious about institutional organizations, and I think that they find different ways to distribute their philanthropy, whether that's through corporate social responsibility campaigns, through the products that they buy. And so it's not as traditional as perhaps, past generations. And so, certainly I think where we've seen a lot of success for human services organizations, and just in terms of engaging younger demographics, is through kind of a volunteer to donor conversion strategies, where kind of really instituting, I think what Ashika was talking about, where you might see more traditional like independent school strategies, like, where independent schools are maybe, have that kind of focused opportunity to kind of instill a culture of philanthropy amongst their community. Human services organizations kind of trying to instill that culture of philanthropy amongst their donor bases. Volunteer bases.
Ian, thank you so much for that. That aligns perfectly with what Pam is saying also in the chat, volunteer opportunities related to mission, but also volunteer opportunities related to donor relations. So is there a junior board? Is there a committee or some kind of event that you can organize young people around so that they can take an active role in the community building process related to philanthropy? There was also a question in the chat about organizations seeing success with online giving. And there are tons of really great reports in this post-pandemic world that show kind of how organizations were forced to make it a little bit easier for donors to give online and sort of not rely on checks coming through the mail. And I do encourage you all to really think about that. I know personally, I've seen in real time just small changes, like even to a website that make it easier for a donor to find the giving button, to bigger changes like instituting Apple Pay, for example. So someone can go right through their mobile device all the way through to your giving page, make a gift without having to input credit card information or do those pieces kind of through a secure device. All of that is making a difference. One organization that I stay very close with in regards to this, because they sort of started in the online world, back in the early 2000s, before it was really, really popular to be raising money online, is Direct Relief. And I encourage you all to kind of take a look at their website, which does host a lot of their electronic campaigns. They do disaster-related giving in the space of human services. Related to medicine. So they do rely on getting the word out quickly, getting dollars in even quicker, just to mobilize in time to meet the need, where online giving and sort of online calls to action can really help move your work forward. Good question in the chat about cryptocurrency. And a lot of hot discussion, especially in our sector, about how to make it possible. Is it financially viable to start accepting and considering cryptocurrency? We'd love to continue to hear from you all in the chat about this. So please share your thoughts. I'm wondering even, Ian, if we want to pivot to our breakout room so we can get the group kind of talking to each other about some of these questions and the ones that we might pose.
Yeah, I know we are quickly running out of time, so I think it'd be great to go to the breakout rooms. And I do think organizations, Catherine, great to see you. By the way, but yes, and they're kind of treating it similar to kind of a stock gift, and we can certainly talk more about that offline. But let's jump in, and then I think we're returning here, right, Ashika? Mm-hmm. Okay.
For a moment of time, I know others were kind of making their way back, but I'll start with our closing remarks, and others will kind of come in just as these breakout rooms close. It was interesting to see and hear in the room that I was in, us immediately kind of move to a topic related to retention and acquisition. And it's kind of a key theme in the sector. It's a key theme in the report, and something that I think we'll all want to be thinking creatively about. I immediately go back to Ian's section of the report and presentation around digital tools that we can use for this, how the database plays an important role in retention and acquisition. But just some closing thoughts from me, Ian. Any thoughts from you? Oh, you're on mute.
That's odd. I didn't press mute. So that's Jenny in the background. Yeah, look, I mean, I just think, when we talked about three things: talent acquisition and retention, donor retention, and the comfort of donors kind of being the comfort of donors with in-person events. Those were the three things that we really talked about that just feel a lot different. Maybe not the donor retention piece, but compared to October and November and 2021, I think for this group, this sector, donor retention's been on our minds since January and February of last year. But the talent acquisition and talent retention is a big struggle, and then just donors want to be in person again, and there's a growing comfort with that, and I think catering to that's top of mind. So look, I mean, it is the top of the hour. That was the most efficient breakout group ever. But listen, thank you, everyone. We've enjoyed the conversation today, and look forward to seeing you again. Ashika, I didn't know if there was any housekeeping kind of final comments.
No housekeeping. Please check out the longer report. Thank you all for making the time. We hope to see you again at one of our presentations soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.